welcome to the show, Russ. How are you? How are
Hi.
things in the UK?
Things in the UK, well, the sun's out, as you can see from the very bright window. But yes, we are like the rest of the world, all working from home and in lockdown. But I'm smiling, the sun's out, and it's a beautiful day.
Very good to see. A lot of people know about EQ, IQ, but a lot of people do not know what you're doing, AQ. So please, can you please introduce yourself and explain what you're doing with this new company that you started?
Perfect. Yeah, so it's Ross Thornley, as you said. I'm in the UK. I've been an entrepreneur for just over 20 years. I've set up and run a number of different successful businesses in brand, marketing, innovation, some product businesses. And a lot of the observations that I found in periods of accelerated change, and particularly at the edges of innovation, was an inability to adapt. So this sense of how do we stop doing something that has always been successful for us before, and start to learn new ways of doing things? How do we embrace things that often feel counterintuitive, and often an immune system comes up of human beings? Oh, we've always done it this way. And it's this balance between when do we have grit and we persevere for something, when do we experiment, and when are we flexible, when do we embrace technologies like AI and different things. And so in observing that, our recognition was failing to adapt can mean the difference between collapsing and going bankrupt. So that could be as an individual or as a company. If the environment changes and you don't adapt to it, you're failing. And in the complete opposite is true. If you're able to adapt to new opportunities and new situations, you can often get promotions or take on new market opportunities, and your company can thrive. So what we wanted to do was say, well, how do we improve it? And if you want to improve anything, you have to measure it first. So we then went down this rabbit hole of defining what is adaptability, how would you measure it? And we came up with this concept of AQ, Adaptability Quotient. We have about 15 different dimensions that take ability, character, and environment. And all of these things either inhibit or accelerate one's ability to adapt to change and successfully navigate it. So that's what we've been focusing on.
Does the cultural Q, the CQ, is taking into account in your AQ?
Yeah, so culture is an interesting one, and we have this plethora of almost survey fatigue, and how many more Q, things can we have, from social quotient to cultural quotient and all of these different things. So our model takes into account abilities. So these, as I say, are things like resilience, ability to bounce back from a challenge or something that didn't go correctly, an ability to unlearn. And then there are character aspects. So these are things like what's the motivation style? Do I change when I am wanting not to lose? So a lot of my changes are survival orientated. So it requires something, for example, like COVID-19, for me to come and embrace working from home or doing things on Zoom, because it's a survival mechanism. Or am I motivated because I'm playing to win? Oh, there's a new thing here. I'm looking at the advantages of Zoom or working from home, and I'll do it whether there was a burning platform or not. Those are characteristics that might motivate somebody to change differently. And then there are other factors which are environmental. So in answer to your question, not specifically from culture, but certainly from character is a big part of who adapts and why.
All right. So with this crisis, the COVID-19, do you see this as an opportunity for your company and what you're developing? I guess a lot of companies are now looking at what you're doing and saying, hey, I need to assess my employees and see if they're ready to, might be too late actually for them. Did you see a peak of activity?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think this whole subject of information, and at what point is information helping you to make decisions and when is it hindering? And it's the balance between when information is noise and when it's a signal. And what we've noticed is, for a number of organizations, even before COVID-19, they were looking at how adaptable are they? How adaptable are they as an organization, and how adaptable are their employees, knowing that a lot of technology is driving changes? So how they adopt new systems, new processes, that they were reaching out and saying, we want adaptable leadership. We want adaptable employees. And in fact, in countless surveys, the last sort of 4 or 5 years of the LinkedIn top soft skill surveys, adaptability has been in the top 5 of hundreds, if not thousands, of soft skills as being a key one that is being looked for. So I think what it's highlighted right now is that the environment has changed. The environment has changed in terms of things that how we chose to do work has now been taken away from us. So we have to adapt potentially at an accelerated scale than maybe we have done before. So it's brought a narrative for a lot of our clients to say, this is exactly what we mean by accelerated change. How adaptable are you? Can you set up and experiment new processes and structures? Can you unlearn that, oh, we can only do that meeting when we're physically next to each other? To, oh, we have to do things with Zoom. We can only do that when we're connected in this secure environment to connect to that kind of area. Then maybe that's why we should have had all our data in the cloud. We haven't even got laptops, let alone access to, all the passwords, all the file, all the structure, all the security of things. So I think having information that is relevant at the right time allows you to make good decisions. And one of the areas that we've seen is everybody adapts slightly differently. Some this will be absolute fear, and they don't know how because their entire routine and structures have changed. Others will be going, this is fantastic. I'm really enjoying it. I'm getting so much more done. I don't have to commute. It's the same thing, but people approach it in different ways. If you don't know how people are adapting to that change and you're only seeing the outcome, which is either masked because they don't want to show you how much they're stressed or coping, or they do want to show you how much they're stressed, you can't put any interventions or support with it. So what our assessment does, it's a half an hour conversation with a chatbot, and it will give that individual an instant dashboard of their insights. And from an organizational basis, it gives an aggregated view of what things like reskill index, change readiness, that we use in AI algorithms to be able to predict who might need more support and how would you actually go about supporting them. Because a key thing is the fact that this is improvable. It's not like many of these personality profiles and things that says, this is your series of letters, or this is your color, or this is who you are, and it's fixed. The whole notion of a fixed personality is, to me, an oxymoron. It is changeable by our environment and by our situation, and so is adaptability. So it's a muscle, we can improve it.
How age impact this AQ? Because what I read, preparing this with this discussion, is that unlearning and learning is connected to how plastic is your brain. Yeah. And when you get older, your ability to learn and mechanically to unlearn is impacted. So I guess age is one of the factors that you use to compute this AQ.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting concept. And at the moment, we've been focusing very much on work and in the work environment and context. So I want to give that lens and framework of adaptability, because we might adapt differently, for example, in a health situation. I'm healthy, then I'm not healthy. For example, how we adapt could be different. And so I don't have the data there. But certainly in work, what we've noticed is certainly a correlation between work tenure as opposed to age in certain positions of how much they are able to unlearn or learn, right? So we have a familiarity. We also have something called a fostered acceptability. So that's the way things have always been. So I'm not either willing to unlearn or not. That isn't necessarily so linked to age. It's more linked to how long you've been in that role. And also, one of the other concepts that we've been exploring, and it's been playing out in the data, is almost like an adaptability wake. So you're probably familiar with the sentiment that we're the sum of the 5 people we spend the most time with, right? Adaptability has some of those similar characteristics. So you could take somebody who is highly adaptable and put them in the environment with 5 others that aren't very adaptable, and it'll have rub off. It'll have this wake around them. So adaptability is not an isolated thing. You can take somebody who is, let's say, your assumption and thought process around brain elasticity and plasticity and age. They're older, they're not able to unlearn so easily. If they're with a load of other people who are exactly the same, that will perpetuate to true. What we've seen is if you put them in an environment where lots of people are unlearning and they're seeing that the flexibility and experimentation to embrace new things, that can have a rub off on people of those things. So it's a bit like the reverse mentoring, for example, to allow people to see things differently. So I hope that bit of conversation might dispel a few myths of you can't teach old dogs new tricks. Put an old dog with a lot of younger dogs, and I think you'll find that they do both adapt and find happy mediums often.
Very interesting. So what you're mentioning right now is also that the organization, so you measure your AQ is on the person level, but at the end, because it's an organization, what is really important is to measure the organization AQ.
Correct. And we're doing that in the framework of individuals to make up teams, and then we have team reports, and then team reports to make up an organizational level. Obviously, there's multiple factors in an organization's AQ that is more than the sum of its parts. So there are other data sets that we are acquiring from organizations that's not just the individual measures and assumptions to be able to predict that. What we're hopeful in the future is that AQ becomes a new asset class of due diligence for a whole range of things for companies. If you're going to invest in a company in an exponential changing world, how adaptable they are is going to be a key predictor of future success. And at the moment, that isn't an asset class that's looked at. It's looked at what's the past performance, what's going on, not necessarily are they able to pivot? Do they bring out new products on an 18-month cycle, or is it on a 30-day cycle? How adaptable are they so that when something changes, do they go out of business or not? Here in the UK, Flybe's has gone out of business before COVID-19. We're going to see a plethora of organizations unable to adapt to this rapid change, and we will see massive loss in bankruptcies and jobs because of that inability to pivot quickly enough. If we knew what the AQ was at an organizational level, those at risk irrelevant potentially of the industry, all restaurants, they're now closed, they're going to go out of business. The ones who are led by people with high AQ and as an organization that have high AQ are able to, within one day, have all of their, online to be able to deliver, meals, that they've looked at different ways of generating revenue. They've looked at selling vouchers for when it comes the other end so that they can maintain cash flow to be there. So all of these things are going to be predictors of future success within that.
And do you think AQ can be used for recruitment as well? A company are going to do this assessment before they hire someone or not?
Yeah, it's certainly a huge area of current assessments, right, is to help us understand what's behind the mask and the black box of a person. That, you see them and, we use this terrible thing called a CV that looks at what they've done in the past. And then we try to marry and predict how are they going to perform in an entirely new environment. Even if it's the same role, it's in a different organization, therefore it's going to have a different outcomes. And I think there will be definite advantage to understanding the adaptability of individuals in a recruitment basis. And what I would like to see us do is do that holistically with a range of other things rather than the thing, and do it in a way that allows opportunity where others couldn't. So, for example, we're going to need to reskill and upskill hundreds of millions. 375 million people have got to be reskilled and upskilled. And if we only ever used what they'd done in the past to think, what can they do next, whether they get hired or not, if they are adaptable, maybe we might just give opportunities to people that don't currently have the skills, that until we say, no, go and get that skill. When you've got it, come back. Whereas as an employment, if we go, okay, they're aligned in our culture. Their mission is aligned, they're aligned with our purpose, but they don't necessarily have the skill that is required right now. But we can take both that journey mutually, knowing that they're going to be adaptable, to help train them to perform for us tomorrow. And I think that shift will happen in recruitment for sure, especially when a majority of skills required for the roles in the future don't even exist yet. So we're going to have to train people and find the ones that are highly adaptable for that. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in a terrible situation of need and demand and wanting.
Very, very interesting. So getting back to the AQ on the organizational level. So you mentioned it's not the sum of all the members that make the organization. Would you say that the leadership, the CEO AQ is very important and got a very tremendous impact on the rest of the employees AQ?
It's another really interesting question, and we're at the early stages in terms of last year we had our beta programs. We're in early access at the moment with a number of organizations. So all the time we're gaining more and more data to feed the engine, right? To feed the algorithms, to start to being able to predict these things. But our early indications, I refer back to the comment I was making about the wake of an individual that drives things. We know this happens in terms of those that are incredible motivators, or people that inspire people to be more engaged. We can inspire an adaptability by giving the environmental framework that accelerates adaptability. So what is the level of emotional overwhelm, emotional stress? And that as a leadership team, whilst it's not about how adaptable they are, but it's what conditions have they put in place for the organization to allow others to thrive and become more adaptable. So I think that's a difference that I'd like our listeners to understand is, yes, it's very, very helpful, of course, that do as I do, don't do as I say, that if the leadership are practicing highly adaptable characteristics and abilities, then that's great. But they also have this opportunity to create environments that allow it, that allow resilience to be built. And resilience get built by having failure and having the support network to say, have another go. Let's fail forward. And let's look at experimentation. And that comes from an environment of how much pressure do you have in there? If everything has to work, then the level of risk and experimentation and innovation is going to be reduced. So a leadership team can give those kind of situations and processes and structures to encourage and enrich the opportunity for adaptability to thrive and grow.
All right. So AQ, I believe AQ is really, really timely, giving the context of this crisis. So a lot of companies now need to adapt, right? So what would you advise, and what would be, some tips that you will give to our listener, if the AQ is terribly bad at the moment? Let's say the AQ is really bad. So is there anything they could do to improve this score, or they're doomed to fail?
That's really interesting. The first thing I want to just very quickly touch on is there a bad score and is there a good score, right? Of course, at the very edges, there is good and bad. If we consider weight, for example, I invent these scales that I go and stand on, and a needle moves and it shows me what weight I am. And there'll be a good and bad in general terms. There'll also be a good and bad, which relates to what's my goal? What's the outcome that I want? Do I want to run an ultra marathon, or do I want to win a sumo wrestle? Or do I just want to be able to, go about my day and not get ill? Where the needle goes is relevant to what you're trying to achieve. So in terms of good and bad is relevant to what you want to achieve. I might not want somebody highly adaptable if they're operating on me, for example. I want something that is, I don't want you to change. I don't want you to experiment, experiment in VR, and in scenarios where it's less risk, right? But not when there's life and death in place. So I think the adaptability is contextual to what your goal is of whether it's good or bad. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is to have a language. So start with some curiosity. Adaptability, is going to be the number one superpower for humans to thrive in the future. It always has been, but in accelerated exponential times, it becomes the most critical thing to our survival. As Darwin, has his work has evolved into lots of Chinese whispered, but let's just say, the strongest is, it's not the strongest or the fittest, but it's the most adaptable to change that will survive. And I think that's very true in an exponential area. So be curious. You can always, take a look at our aqai.io site. We are in the process now where we're still accepting a few early access organizations and people where they can get their assessment complimentary, so that they can start to understand and learn about the different aspects. Because once you can see where you are, then you start to go, now I can do something. So without me standing on the needle, on the weight to see where the needle is, I don't know whether the nutrition or exercise is doing anything. So if I can assess myself, I then start to learn about resilience. I start to learn about grit. I start to learn about unlearning. And I can then go off on a whole rabbit, deep dive. The internet's wonderful for this. You can spark this conversation. I heard this guy, Ross, talking about AQ and this thing, unlearning. Oh, that's interesting. Next thing you can do, the first tip is Google these things. There's a great book by Barry O'Reilly, good friend of mine, written called Unlearning. I've got my book coming out called Decoding AQ, which talks about all of the subdimensions and aspects and tips of how do you improve resilience, for example. Little things like practicing gratitude or all sorts of different things that are there. So go and discover, get curious, and begin to have a language of adaptability that's more than just that word, and start to look at the dimensions that make up adaptability. It's much more important.
All right. So I was about to ask you a book that you could recommend, but you mentioned your book. Maybe you can mention another one.
Yeah, I think, there are quite a few different books, some specifically, yes, about adaptability. There's one, another friend of mine, Cameron Herold, wrote Double Double. And chapter 11 is particularly important right now. And it's talking about how do you thrive in a downturn. So he's somebody who's led businesses in the 87, in 2001, 2009, all of these various economic seismic shifts. And how do you thrive in those situations? What are the changes in mindset and thinking? So chapter 11 in Double Double by Cameron Herold is a great book. And what else would I recommend as a really interesting book? If you want a glimpse into the future, Peter Diamandis's The Future is Faster Than You Think is also an excellent...
the recently one, right?
That is his most recent. Yeah.
Last month. Yep. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for sharing what you're currently doing. Is there anything we could wish for you during this crisis?
I think
more clients, more customers.
The one thing I'd wish
success for AI for AQ.
Yeah, the one thing I'd wish is to have a positive bias in the way we reframe our external factors. So even in the language of seeing this as a crisis, the crisis gives us then a sense of how we should behave in that situation and what that feels like. And I don't want to downplay it or ignore that there are going to be some very, very bad things going on, to lose life, to lose all sorts of things. But what if we frame this that it's happening for us? And our thought to say it's happening for us to help us prepare for something that might have wiped us out if this didn't happen. And in life, what I'd encourage everybody is to look at the framing of a center point around gratitude, and that it's happening for us, that we can positively overcome these things. So that one of the key aspects in adaptability is hope. Without hope and optimism, you've got no future. And I want a future where no one's left behind, where we have co-elevation. And for me, the one thing of impact of why I've set up AQAI is to transform how we navigate change. And a lot of that will be in the framing of our mindset and understanding of how we can control and choose to show up irrelevant of whatever goes on and happens. If we can provide people to face whatever challenge in a way that's positively framed, I think our chances of getting through is increased, and especially getting through it with a smile and less tears would be wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. So we wish you all the best, and we'll be in touch. We'll probably read your book.
Thank you. That's really great. That book is coming out in a couple of months' time. My previous book called Moonshot Innovation, you'll find that on Amazon as well if you're interested. Yep. About how do you take exponential technologies to solve some of the grandest challenges in the world. It's called Moonshot Innovation on Amazon as well. So thank you as well. It's been a real pleasure to have our conversation, and I hope it's given some food for thought and value for the listeners.
I believe we did.